First of all, just good morning and thanks to everyone for coming. It's really great to see you all here, and especially appreciate Dwight and Christy for inviting me and helping me do this. So, artists, how many artists do we have in here? Raise your hand. Painters? Okay, so a fair bit of what I'm going to say to you all this morning will be very familiar, but bear with me because this first talk is going to lay the foundation for the second. And I want to talk about three things. The artist's calling to beauty, how beauty makes the artist more at home in the world, how he reaches out to others through beauty, and how we can come to know others and be known through beauty. But first, I want to begin with what I think of as a good working definition, an artist's working definition of beauty itself. So I'll divide this up into two talks, as Dwight said, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, so I'm going to move briskly. Let's get this going. Does that work? So, as Dwight said, that's my dad. Some of you may have known my father, also Charles DeAntonio, who was active in Mount Pleasant and all over the Low Country as an artist for about 45 years. And I loved and admired my father a great deal. And we were especially close toward the end of his life. And when he died in 2018, it broke my heart. And it softened my heart as much as anything. And in the following months, I came to understand my calling as an artist in a new way, and I'll explain. So, from my training, such as it was, and from the culture I had grown up in, I had developed a very academic idea and approach to art. And it was a way of thinking about art that had a lot to do with what I had heard in lecture halls and read in history books. In other words, I was taught how to fit my work into a political and historical context and try to make it count. But listening to the testimonies of what seemed like dozens of people who knew my father and fondly remembered him after he died, and sorting through the work that he left behind, his paintings and drawings and so on, I saw how much he loved people. And that love that he had for people shone through his work. And I think that's one of the reasons people were as attracted to my dad's work as they were. So after hearing these things, I realized that in my own work, I had ventured further and further into that academic understanding of art, and I'd allowed that to push love for my fellow man aside. Not entirely, but enough that it made a difference. And so I was forced to reevaluate my work, reevaluate what beauty is and why that matters to us. Now, I think there's a lot of popular confusion about beauty, and I was wrapped up in a little bit of that myself. So what I found is all good, and that's what I want to share with you all this morning. So, what does a working definition of beauty look like? It looks like three related yet distinct things: primary beauty, free expression, and redemptive beauty. It's interesting that we're hearing these themes already this morning. As Dwight said, that's unplanned. First, if we look at the Judeo-Christian story of beginnings, we read that God imposed order on a chaotic world, filled it with living things, and how he planted a garden for us, put us in it to enjoy and share with him and look after it. And exactly how he made us and how long that might have taken is another question. But what I see when I read this story is a picture of home, our home of abundant, harmonious life. So that's chapters 1 and 2, and then in chapter 3, we lose it, and we're expelled. And in the diminished circumstances that we find ourselves now, we long to have those things again and to regain our home. So this longing for our lost home is, I believe, what drives us to create our artistic expressions of what I call primary beauty. And these are images of harmonious life, abundant harmonious life in paintings, literature, music, theater, and so on. So I'll be looking at mostly paintings this morning because that's my medium of choice, but I think what I'm going to say can be applied to all of these various categories that I mentioned above. So, trying to let the paintings speak for themselves as much as I can, I want to start with this. This is John Constable's wheat field that he painted in 1816. And it has all of these marvelous elements that speak of this abundant, harmonious life. This is painted in Suffolk, England, where Constable was born in 1776, and is just bursting with life and abundance. The wheat is obviously a sign of abundance of the present time. So they're bringing the harvest in. And then if you look in the bottom right corner, you can see a boy and a dog guarding the lunch baskets, which contain harvests from years past, meats and cheese and wine and bread. And then if you look over to the left, you can just barely make out someone plowing a field in preparation for the following year. So the past, the present, and the future abundance are all there. And this speaks of a land that is a home for these people and sustains them for generations to come. And then there's a tremendous amount of harmony in all of it. The way that these people are working together to bring in the harvest, cutting the wheat together and binding it in sheaves, and gleaning. And in the background, you can see how the various patches of land are laid out for various uses. For agriculture, obviously, but also for livestock. And there's where they live. You can see the houses and barns in the far distance. So it's just a beautiful picture of abundant, harmonious life. And this is all over European art and American art, of course. This is another Constable of a more genteel scene, but all the elements are there. Another John Constable, very pretty painting, and it just looks settled and right. So John is credited with handing us the modern landscape painting, and these paintings are still very charming to us even today. Here's a Dutch still life, obviously very abundant and beautifully arranged. And there's youthful beauty. I mean, obviously very full of life, her whole life in front of her, and just shining with the harmony of good health. So this is very straightforward. I mean, there's very little to be controversial about any of this. There's another Constable painting. There's Chardin's maid coming home from the market with food for the following day, and here's a Vermeer. I think most people can agree that these are beautiful paintings, and there's very little to argue about. But because, I skipped ahead. Where this gets a little bit difficult for people, I think, is when you bring in all of the different things that people do when they paint or create works of art. Because we're made in the image of a creative God, we have this desire, this need really to express ourselves in our daily lives. And over the millennia, we've developed various media to better express ourselves: drawing, music, dance, painting, sculpture, literature, theater, and so on. And so traditions are developed as we take up these media and add content, techniques, various styles to them. We pass them along to successive generations, and traditions arise. And these are just very well-established vocabularies of beautiful expression in any given medium. So that's all well and good. These artistic traditions are collective, and yet they contain various individual contributions. So tensions are introduced. And all these different people in the mix doing different things. All of us work within some tradition or another, but we all add something new to what we do as we go. It's how dramatically or how abruptly this happens. It can sometimes create tension and confusion regarding the question of beauty and art. And this is a great example of where you see variations in individual expression. This is Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring and Rembrandt's self-portrait. These guys lived within a few hours of each other at the same time, in the same part of the world, and were working very much in the Dutch tradition. And they have very different approaches. Vermeer on the left was much more in keeping with the general idea of Dutch painters to paint in this very refined style, whereas Rembrandt was much looser with his brush strokes. They're very similar paintings. The pose is the same, the format is the same, but they each bring something different. Vermeer's paintings are almost magical to look at if you've seen them up close. And what he does is he puts down the paint in such a way that you really can't tell where one brush stroke ends and another begins. They're just beautiful to behold. Very smoothly modeled. And it's a very soft way of depicting things. And here's Rembrandt. Very different. When you get up close to one of these things, you can really see every brush stroke. Very rough surface of what they call impasto painting, which is where you just lay down a bunch of paint on the canvas and leave the strokes there for people to see. So you can see how he moved his hand while he was painting this, and the sequence of the brush strokes. And you can even see places where the raw canvas is poking through, showing through on the right corner of his eye there. So different also, I think, in the content and feel of them. Vermeer's Girl is young and beautiful. He's depicted her in these beautiful colors. Her expression is very open, and the light just very gently envelops her. It's a beautiful expression of youthful optimism and potential. Whereas Rembrandt, how do I back up with this thing? There. Rembrandt, obviously this is a very different subject because it's an old man compared to a young woman, but I think the artist's choice of subject is part of his style. And in his picture of himself, he's very careworn, and the years have weighed heavily on him. If you've read about Rembrandt's life, you'll know that it was a difficult life for him in ways, and quite sad in some ways. And so instead of the light enveloping him, it looks as if the darkness is reaching around him from behind and threatening to overtake him. And just backing up a little bit and casting the net wider, you have the European tradition of portraiture in general, with this ancient Greek funerary portrait that was dug up somewhere in Greece. Here's the 14th century English portrait of King Richard. Here is something from the 15th century in, I think, Flanders. This is Isabella Brandt, painted by Rubens, just full of life and mirth. I love this picture. Here's Elizabeth Lebrun's self-portrait, which is just full of color. It reminds us of Vermeer's girl, I think on purpose. I like the way she's included her palette. And a very different painting by Copley of an American man, very handsome, but very pared down. Here's Van Gogh sort of throwing the palette, everything that he has on his palette at this portrait. There's the 20th century portrait of our American President Roosevelt, I think, and that's me in the 21st century. So all of these things are very different, and yet we regard them all as very beautiful, I think. And this does complicate things a bit. So again, pretty straightforward. Where this gets interesting and difficult for people, I think, is this abrupt change that I was talking about. So there was this infamous Salon des Refugiés in Paris in 1863, and the 1860s and 1870s in Paris were controversial. So you had a French, there's a slide missing, that's okay. You had a French viewing public that was very well versed in the language of visual art, and they were very sharply critical. And then you had a French Academy, a governmental institution that decided what could be seen and what couldn't in these big exhibitions in Paris. This was the official look that was approved by the Academy. And so people were flocking to these things to see work like this. And instead, they were confronted with something like this. And it caused a huge furor. People were very upset and divided over this. Back in the day when painting really was the way that people expressed themselves and explored ideas. So if they were looking for a maritime painting like this and were confronted with this instead, they were confused because it seemed poorly drawn. There didn't seem to be much of a narrative there. They couldn't understand what they were supposed to be taking away. Landscape painting. This was the sort of thing that they were looking for, and this is the sort of thing they were met with. People were very interested in Impressionism, and they would press to get into the galleries, but it was also ridiculed in the press. They had political cartoons mocking these things, so it was very important to them and very controversial. So this is, for us, for our time, I think it would be kind of like expecting to see this unveiled in Charleston and being presented with this. Just very shocking to people. So I think this is a lesson to artists everywhere, that we tend to be very wrapped up in what we do, and our head is in it, and we're churning out all these images, and we present things to people a little bit in a somewhat confrontational way. And I hear artists say this, like they didn't understand it, but that's really their problem. And I think what we need to do a little bit more than we have been is bring people along for the ride and give them a handle with regards to challenging work like this, and help them get acclimated to it. So, what I want to talk about now is perhaps the most challenging thing of the three types of beauty. So even this picture, even though it's different from something like this, both of these are clearly images of abundant, harmonious life. But when you get to something like this, there's no way that you can look at someone who's being tortured and executed and call that abundant, harmonious life. And yet, people will look at images like this and think of them and call them beautiful. And so how do you reconcile those things? How do you bring those things under the umbrella of what we think of as beauty? Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal son is a great example of how this is done, I think. We all know the story. The boy demands his inheritance, leaves with it ahead of time, wastes it on fast living, and then has to come home looking like this. He's run into trouble with creditors or someone like that, I think, and they've shaved his head to humiliate him. He's disarmed. You can see the scabbard that hangs on his belt is empty. His clothes are dirty and patched. His shoes are falling apart. He's just a mess, and he probably smelled terrible. And yet, he's come home, and he's looking for a place to call home again. And his father, instead of rejecting him, which he had a right to do, has embraced him with this gesture of love. And it's just beautiful, the way Rembrandt has captured the sympathy and affection there with the way the man embraces this vagabond. What I think is going on here is that Rembrandt is borrowing from the rich tradition of beauty that's been stored up in European art, particularly in the language of painting, and he's loaning it to something to beautify it, so that paint, particularly oil paint, becomes the beautiful messenger. So this is a fresco, but it's right in with the tradition in Europe of thousands and thousands of images of this first kind of beauty, abundant, harmonious life, in which the oil paint, both the medium, how it's been developed and evolved over the years, and the European pictorial language have been adapted to convey images of beauty so that the paint itself becomes beautiful to us, and we learn to expect paintings and oil paint itself to be beautiful. And that's the way we've learned to interact with these things. That's Raphael, that's Da Vinci, and then we have Tiepolo and Vermeer again, and I don't know who that is. I think it's Boucher. It's a very pretty painting. But you can see the language of these pictures and the way that the drapery is depicted and all that in something like this. So this is Rubens' Descent from the Cross, and he's done it. He's taken the objectionable object, the repugnant thing, like the vagabond that we looked at before, which in this painting is a dead body, and he's enveloped it in beauty and in a sense redeemed something, I think. And you can especially see that here with these two figures. Beautiful young women wearing beautiful, colorful clothes. They're just bursting with youth and health. And they're embracing the repugnant thing, the dead man's foot, as it rests on her shoulder. She's placing herself under it and, in a sense, redeeming it. So it's a very effective image of redemptive beauty. Here's Caravaggio's betrayal of Christ, which they found in somebody's house in Ireland recently. And here's Jacob Jordaen's picture of a crucified Christ, which brings it full circle. So what's interesting about this, I think, from a Christian perspective, is that the techniques and the language of the oil painting and what they're doing with it in these images, they're paralleling the redemptive story of Christ. So God takes of his great stores of goodness and life and abundance and grace, and he embraces us with it and redeems our suffering. And so with this image, you get it all in one, where you've got all the elements that I talked about, plus Jesus himself paying the price and winning life for us and beautifying our suffering, redeeming our suffering. So this redemptive beauty is a fascinating aspect of all of this, I think. But it causes confusion, I think, with regard to how we define beauty And I think this is why people shy away from trying to draw a circle around things that are beautiful and exclude other things. It's very difficult to get your head around things like this. So, in conclusion, I want to say that what I've done here is clearly not a comprehensive philosophical definition of beauty. It's just how I see it as a working artist. I'm somebody who wrestles with this stuff as my job. And so my perspective of it is a little bit different from an academic perspective or a philosopher's perspective or a theologian's perspective, perhaps. I think that we're driven to pursue beauty because it's put in our hearts. That ancient home that we all long for is still somehow resonating for us, and we all want it. All people want this. This is where beauty really touches on all humanity. So I'm attempted to identify here what drives us to seek after beauty in the world and in works of art. And it doesn't address all the aspects of how we encounter beauty, but I think it gives us a kind of handle and a reasonable way to look at this as Christians and artists. I think a lot of artists understand this intuitively, and so I might not be telling you anything new this morning, but out there in the world, people are very confused about beauty. And so I feel like it's part of our calling to clarify and exemplify beauty for people. And as Dwight mentioned and others, pull people in and draw them in. And I'd also like to say that all three of these I see as having very equal value. So today we're living in an age where free expression is really emphasized, and that's really where our heads are at with all of this. But the traditional type of beauty that I talked about, that primary beauty, is very valid, and it might seem saccharine or a chocolate box, but it's something that we should explore with people. The redemptive beauty is very difficult. That's a hard thing to pull off, but I think it has its rewards. So I'm going to end there, and Dwight.
Does anybody have a question for Charles from that part one? Any question that you have? Victoria.
This isn't really a question, it's more kind of an observation. When you talk about redemptive beauty, and as you mentioned, beauty has so many different definitions and, beauty in the eye of the beholder kind of thing, but when I look at some of those images, especially the tragic images, it makes me think of, it's beautiful because it expresses, like the prodigal son, it expresses forgiveness and mercy, and this image, it just depicts grace and love and all those things that are expressed in Christ giving himself for us. And you can look at that and say that's a beautiful painting because it's so well done, it's so well crafted, beautiful colors, and it's just it's so realistic, hyper realistic, but the beauty is, a lot of the time for me, the beauty is in the subject matter. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really gravitate towards works of art that have a subject matter that I can relate to and or that speaks to me. And this kind of work is so appealing because of the story behind it and what it represents. And and I appreciate you helping to clarify the different kinds of beauty and your descriptions of those. That's really great. Thank you.
I think that the redemption story resonates with people all over the place, and I think that just as we have God's law written on our hearts, I think we also have this desire for redemption. I mean, you see redemption all over the place in secular culture. People want this, And so you immediately, I think, connect with something like this. And it touches you in the same place that a beautiful thing will, or even grief. It's very interesting how these things that seem opposite can overlap. And where it makes sense is in the Christian church. And that's the reason, that's what's so interesting about all this to me. Yes.
You may have answered this and I was too thick. Would you say that there's an artist or a particular work that encompasses all three of those in a single work, or would you say that's possible?
Well, yes. Okay, so all these guys that I've chosen are really good at this.
Who is that artist, by the way, again, this painter?
That's Rubens.
Rubens, okay.
Okay, and so he was a big deal. And he had a workshop. He had painters working for him. He was a very interesting character, a Christian. He was a diplomat. They would send him to countries as a painter so he could kind of listen in and talk to people. He was an extraordinary individual, and his life is very interesting. But yes, so it's traditional looking to us, but Rubens is exercising his free expression in this. You can't get away from that. But he's also working within a tradition and bringing people along for the ride. And then he's worked this. He's got stuff that's just pretty. You can find it all over his paintings. But I think, yes, to answer your question, all three. Another place where you see this going on is in church. So if you show up here on a Sunday morning, you're going to get it in the music and in the order of things and in the liturgy. At St. Philip's, the same sort of thing is happening. It's just the emphases are a little bit different, that's all. So.
I'm not sure this is a question, but it's something I ponder about, and maybe you can expound upon it. It seems that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I know in some areas of Christendom, art, visual art is like music. Like there is a box, and we'll put good music or good art in this box. And if it's outside the box, it's bad art or music.
Yeah.
And the photograph of, I presume it was a statue, but it looked like a real person, kind of stood up by a 2x8 or whatever it was.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to back up to it so we can see it.
Yeah.
It's fun. I wish I could have been there for this one because it looks like it was fun to see. Oh, we'll get there one day. There it is.
Okay. Could you speak about that?
Well, this is the
That's my question, I guess.
This is the 1960s. And they were trying to break the bounds of what they thought of as traditional art. And so the thing you have to remember about everything that happens more or less after 1920 or so is that what a lot of modern artists were doing, including myself early in my career, because I used to paint abstract pictures, is they were intentionally breaking with tradition. And they had the idea that if they did that, they could remake art and do something that had never been done before. And so they tried all kinds of crazy things to do it. And what they wound up finding was they were still after the same things. So what I'm trying to say with my little idea about art and beauty is that it's the things that propel us, that compel us to create, that are the same. And you see various expressions of it all over the world. And when you look at it from that perspective, instead of trying to draw a circle around it and say, this is beautiful and this isn't, it helps you understand why people make the things that they do. And then you can link something that someone is doing in the jungle in South America or something like that that's never seen any of this stuff and the sort of work that we're doing, I think. Because if we trace it back to God's creative act of putting all of this stuff here, then that would mean that we all have the same origin, and we all have the same desires and fears. And so that's really what art is. It's just people dealing with desire or fear. I've talked mostly about desire here, but there's a fear element as well. And so that falls within the panoply of beauty, and some people might regard this as beauty and beautiful, and that's fine. But I think where we get into trouble is where we throw stuff like that up in front of people and say, deal with it, instead of gently bringing them along for the ride. Now, this artist, I don't really know, may have done that. It happens in New York City. Everybody's along for the ride there. But if we go up there and look at it, it seems weird to us because we're not acclimated. So it really is a question of just reaching out to people and saying, hey, what do you think? And then talking to them and developing relationships so that they start to understand your particular language. It's difficult to do with modern art because they keep changing it up. But with traditional art, you can work within a tradition and just move it along. You still get to be yourself, but you just work within slightly more narrow confines, if that makes sense.
That's the mistake I made with fifth grade.
Okay.
I didn't mean to, but what I was saying to them is, you can't read,
Uh-huh.
deal with it,
Yeah.
rather than, I see you, I hear you, let's go together.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, way too much.
And that's what I want to address in the next talk, is this whole idea of reaching out to people in the gesture of friendship. And it just takes time. Again, it has a lot to do with just abrupt change rather than gradual change. Anybody else?